This is the WP Elevation Podcast, helping WordPress consultants elevate.
So I'm just a little bit nervous now because we're about to go and meet one of my web design heroes, Andy Clarke from Stuff and Nonsense. So here we go. Yes!
Yes!
It is!
Right!
Yes! Man of mystery.
How are you?
Lovely to meet you after all this time. In 3 dimensions. Thank you. Thanks, Jay. Play pool? I do. Yeah, I do. We should. You play? Yeah. We should have a game. Record a very brief chat. Yeah. And then we'll find somewhere to go and have some lunch. G'day, Troy Dean here from WP Elevation, and I'm very excited to have with me here in the WP Elevation office here, Andy Clarke from Stuff and Nonsense. Hey Andy, how are you?
I'm all right.
It's an absolute pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, in the flesh this time.
Thank you very much for coming in. Now, Andy, as everyone here knows, has been one of my web design heroes for a long time without putting you on the spot. Is actually one of the reasons I'm still doing what I'm doing today was I started out reading .NET magazine that you were contributing to. Tell me how that came about originally.
Do you know, I can't remember back in the day, because I was one of the early people that were designing and writing CSS. So there was only a small pool of people, loosely termed talent, I suppose, that they could have. And I think they set up like an advisory committee just to, they changed direction at the beginning. I remember back in, this is 97, literally, like right at the early days, Net Magazine used to do this thing called like Site of the Month. Yep. And it was like a user-reader contributing thing. And they actually featured my site. I think it was September or October 1997. My first ever website was in .NET Magazine. Wow. Because it was really a consumer mag. And then they shifted the focus. They shifted it to being much more kind of a professional magazine. And, you know, I was one of those people that they asked if I'd be an advisory board member, but I never really did anything.
Right. So one of the things, Gin's just having a look at my collection of, there we go, .NET magazines. I've got a whole bunch of them over there. I subscribe.
From 1997.
No, not from 1997. They would have been from, when were they from? They would have been from, I reckon, around about 2006 onwards. Yeah. Was when I was really learning my way. One of the things that occurred to me was there was this whole thing about standards, about web standards, about coding to particular standards. For those who are watching this and who don't know why standards are important, why do standards matter?
Well, I suppose you've got to go back to before we really stuck to standards in terms of development. I mean, when I started, I remember the first books that I bought in terms of web design back in kind of 96, 97. And I can remember crazy things like DHTML madness or magic or madness. It was madness. I mean, I imagine a lot of people wouldn't even know what DHTML was. And it stood for dynamic HTML. It was like a buzzword like Ajax or responsive design or something like that. It was just a kind of a term for things. But at the time, when we wanted to write something in HTML or CSS or JavaScript, you had to literally write 2 versions. I mean, there was the Internet Explorer DOM and there was the Netscape DOM, and you had to literally write everything twice. And all of the books at the time literally had sort of 2 halves. You know, they'd teach you how to do it on one side, and then it would go, and to get this working in Netscape 4, then we've got to do it another way. And, you know, we had browser sniffing and all that kind of stuff, user agent sniffing. So it was a troubling time because it just sucked up so much time and money and, you know, wasn't sustainable. So it wasn't until designers, particularly people like Jeffrey Zeldman, said, listen, this is just crazy. We can't continue working in this way. There is a standard. You know, there are standards for HTML. There are standards for CSS and for JavaScript, and they happen to be W3C standards. Why don't we just literally sort of center development around those standards? And that's what happened. If it hadn't have been for people like Jeffrey and other people at the Web Standards Project, we'd still be doing everything twice. Because all of the browser makers, they used proprietary standards almost like as business tools, you know, to get commercial advantage. Well, if you use this technology, your website will look much better in our browser than it does in another browser. And they use these things for competitive advantage. So that would be exactly where we'd be now if it wasn't for that.
I guess one of the advantages of standards too is when you're collaborating on a project, or if you take a project over that another developer's been working on, or another developer takes over a project you've been working on, if you're doing everything right and you're working to standards and commenting your code, it's much easier to take over a project than to try and reverse engineer what someone's done before you start.
Well, that's the difference between what we think of as web standards in terms of HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and coding or professional standards. So, I mean, it's actually incredibly hard still. Nobody really likes to take over a project that somebody else has worked on, because things aren't done quite your way and you've got to spend quite a lot of time figuring out how somebody else has worked. And that's why, particularly in larger teams, it's really important to get those kind of internal standards down. My friend Harry Roberts, who's speaking at a conference here in Melbourne this week, he does consultancy just on managing CSS for large projects and large teams, because if you've got a lot of people working on the same code base, then how you write the CSS is really important.
So tell us what you're doing out here in Australia. I mean, you're a long way from home, right?
Yeah, we came here because it's the home of MasterChef. MasterChef Australia. It's the only reason we're here.
You're not joking either, are you? Because we were just chatting with you and Sue about your love for MasterChef Australia. Why do you think it's the best MasterChef in the world?
It is the best MasterChef in the world. I know it wasn't the first MasterChef, because it did come a long time ago. I think it was like in the 80s we had MasterChef. What was that guy called? Was it Lloyd Grossman that used to? It was, yeah, Lloyd Grossman, who was like a TV food critic that started MasterChef back in the 80s or something. And then it disappeared and it came back in the format now. And the British MasterChef is just really mean. Right. You've got this literally pretty much the same format, but you've got a group of judges, one of which I think is Australian. Right. But they're just really horrible to contestants, and it's not an interesting show to watch. It's like torture. So we've watched a few. We've watched a little bit of New Zealand MasterChef. But it's just a pale imitation of the Aussie version. Right. We caught an episode of South African MasterChef once. That was like things that people shouldn't eat. Right. It's like, what is that? No, we don't want to eat that. And then I just imagine, we haven't watched any others, but I can just imagine what other MasterChefs are like around the world. You can imagine what the Icelandic MasterChef is like. It's like, what are you cooking? Fish. Right? Or Canadian MasterChef would just be really boring, wouldn't it? Because Canadians.
I'm sure our New Zealand and Canadian counterparts will be commenting underneath this video with lots of feedback. And also, is there something about the Australian location that is appealing in the Australian MasterChef?
Yeah, I mean, they do have nice locations. I mean, they moved, actually, it used to be filmed in Sydney, and I think it switched to Channel 10. How do I know all this stuff about an Aussie TV food programme? But they moved it, and they film it in Melbourne now. So you do get to see, different things. And they go out to places like Margaret River, where we've just been. So yeah, it's a great ambassador show. We learn everything that we know about Aussie culture from MasterChef and Neighbours. Right.
That is frightening in itself, isn't it? Yeah. Right. All right, so apart from MasterChef, you are actually out here doing some business, right?
Yeah. Business kind of, yeah. We're here to speak at a conference and to do some workshops and teach some CSS.
So what's the conference you're speaking at?
I spoke at Respond in Sydney, which is Web Directions, John Allsop's Web Directions podcast. Yeah. Conference. Yeah. Last week in Sydney, which was a really, really good event. He had some great local speakers and a couple of, really good international speakers, and me. Right. So it was fun. It was a really nice, friendly event. I mean, the atmosphere of the conference, sometimes you go to events that are large and very kind of business-like, and sometimes you go to small events and they can leave you feeling a little bit cold, but this was really nice. It had just the right atmosphere.
What sort of numbers were there? How many people turned out? Because Web Directions, particularly, traditionally I've known that they have really good conferences. They're quite expensive ticket price, their conferences. They're not your average $200 conference, are they? Well,
we were talking about this sort of before and after. I mean, I think they had, I can't remember the exact numbers, but let's just say 150. I mean, sure. It wasn't a big room of people. And yeah, they're not the cheapest events in the world, but I think that's a good thing, because we were talking about this after the event. Sometimes we've got to realise that for an industry to be mature, you have to do things to a professional level, and that costs money. And there is a place for smaller community events, not for profits, and we, as an industry, we have a real history of giving stuff away. So it's not like people are being, ungenerous. But if you're going to bring people in, if you're going to get the correct caliber of speakers, and you want to actually have those people making a really great contribution, then sometimes that costs money. And it's very important, I think, as an industry, that we have events that are at that kind of top tier, because it does the whole industry a lot of good. And we need to remember that it's for some people it's a business as well. It's a business for people taking the time out to actually attend these events, because it costs. If you're a freelancer, it's going to cost you time away from client work. If you're working for a business, then they're paying you to be there. But also from the other aspect as well, it's expensive and it's risky to put on events of the size of something like Respond. Yeah. And you mustn't ever forget that people are taking huge risks when it comes to actually putting on an event like that.
Yeah. I was fortunate last week to be up at Content Marketing World in Sydney on a media pass as a podcaster. I was invited up there by Joe Polizzi, and I managed to interview a whole bunch of speakers up there and put together a special episode for the podcast. And that was the thing that was rolling around in the back of my head the whole time I was there, is, they were at a beautiful, like the ballroom at the Sheraton on the Park in Sydney, in a beautiful venue. The catering was amazing. It was a top shelf event. And I thought, you put on that event, I wouldn't want to be the night before not having sold enough tickets, because it's a huge financial risk, and they flew a whole bunch of them out here from the States to present. So you're right, it is a lot of risk involved. What were you actually speaking on at Respond?
I was the counterpoint, I think, to everybody else that has spoken throughout the day or 2 days. I was talking about creative soul and the idea that we've got to balance all of our conversations about technical matters and process and performance, and particularly around responsive design and around user experience design as well. There's been a huge kind of shift towards UX over the last couple of years. And actually, I think that in that process, we've lost certain aspects of creativity. And the work that we're seeing now is dry and sterile and doesn't have... It might be beautifully produced, it might be, beautifully responsive or technically proficient, or, from a UX point of view, classically easy to use, but it doesn't make it memorable. It doesn't make it delightful. And that's what I was really sort of sounding a word of caution about, which is... we need to have both of these things if you're going to make great work.
Let's not be boring, huh?
Yeah, I mean that's not to show too much disrespect to people that concentrate on user experience, because all of these things are important. But as I was saying to one of the other speakers last week, it's like if I wanted to make products, I'd design power drills. That's what I'd make. I'd make hand tools or something. That's not what I do. If you want to design power drills, then brilliant. We all need power drills that are easy to use. What I do is I create websites that sell the power drills. Yeah. And I don't mean just technically in terms of actually, a UX, clicking the button and finding it easy. It's like what makes you get excited about one particular brand over another, both in terms of, particularly in terms of art direction, which is one of the things I've been talking a lot about.
And you're also running some workshops, some CSS workshops while you're out here as well. What are you fundamentally teaching in those CSS workshops?
Same thing I've been teaching for years, really, right. Which is that there's always cutting-edge technologies, particularly in CSS. And particularly now, we went through a real period where CSS was quite boring because we'd figured out all of the problems and we knew everything about CSS. Now, particularly with responsive design and some of the new things that are coming into the standards, that it's exciting again. We can do things in a different way, and we mustn't be afraid of actually using that stuff now, rather than waiting until it's supported in all browsers. So I've been teaching things like Flexbox and also a whole load of other CSS properties, things like columns and border image and stuff like that. That's been around for ages, but nobody uses. And they're really important in a responsive context.
Do you think it's going to get easier now that Internet Explorer has officially been retired?
You mustn't give them a hard time. You must not give them a hard time. They've been doing really well. They've made a great browser over the last few years, and I've always had a lot of respect for the people at Microsoft, actually. I remember back in about 2007, I met a couple of the guys from Microsoft then, and they actually used my site as a testing site for Internet Explorer 7. Because years ago, I had my Stuff and Nonsense site had two versions. It had a version that was for modern browsers, and then if Internet Explorer didn't support those selectors, then they would get a completely different version. It was all in black and white. And there was a whole load of stuff that we used in there. And Microsoft used it as a reference site in their testing lab, which was quite fun. And they were doing some good stuff then. They were really committed to standards, and they were really committed to, a good browser. And they've only carried that on. So you mustn't give them too much stick.
It's. I find it too hard to resist. Was it you, or was it Jeffrey Zeldman and someone else that did the CSS swap day, where you basically took each other's HTML and applied your own CSS? Who was that?
That was Doug Bowman,
right?
Who, up until recently, was creative director at Twitter. And it was Dave Shea, who was the guy behind the CSS Zen Garden back in the day. And that was another incredibly important project. And what they did, in fact, I mentioned it in my book. They literally swapped style sheets for a day and did this whole shtick where they'd stolen each other's designs by accident or something, and it was very funny. But again, it was designed to show that you could separate content and structure from presentation to a certain extent. It's never been, completely possible, and even then they had to swap a few class names around to make it work.
I spent hours exploring CSS Zen Garden when I was starting out, and just seeing, how people, when I was learning CSS, when I was learning about imageless backgrounds and all that kind of stuff, and digging into people's CSS and seeing what they could do with it, because it was one HTML file, it was one HTML, and everyone applied their own CSS to it to come up with these amazing different designs.
Well, it's come back recently. I think Typekit have rehosted it and have taken over the day-to-day running of it. I know my friend Trent Walton has been doing some work. He did a couple of designs on it relatively recently. But I know it sounds as if we're kind of like two old men just sitting there reminiscing about the past. But actually, it's
not far from the truth, is it really?
Not, to be honest. It's completely the truth. But it's actually really important, because I think sometimes today we forget how tricky it was and how much people overcame. We look back at something like a List Apart magazine, and 10 years ago we were reading CSS articles which were about turning an unordered list into a series of tabs, which Doug Bowman wrote. Or there was Dan Cederholm, he did his faux columns article, which was basically, let's just take a transparent GIF or a graduated image and then just run it down a container. Which today you would think, well, why on earth is that a problem? What is that a solution to? But back then, it was solving a real problem. And without people like them, we wouldn't be doing the kind of the sort of CSS work that we're doing today.
Okay, let's talk about the podcast. You're an avid podcaster. You put out a podcast. Is it every week?
No, it's every 2 weeks now. The weekly schedule was getting too much.
Right. And who's your co-host again?
I don't have a regular co-host now. I started off. This is back at the beginning of 2013 with Anna Debenham.
That's right.
And we had this idea that we would do a podcast about business, creative businesses, about accounting maybe, or invoicing or contracts and that kind of stuff. And Anna was the serious one, and I was the one that just provided the banter, I suppose. And then after about 30 episodes, Anna decided that she didn't really want to do it anymore.
Right.
So I had to make the decision about whether to keep it going. And we actually had some sponsor commitments at the time, so I wasn't in a position to just stop it.
Right.
So actually we just changed the format, and for the next year I had like a rolling series of co-hosts. Right. So we would have regular people like Laura Kalbag and Brendan Dawes, and a few others that would kind of be on every few weeks, rather than doing an interview. I did not want to do like an interview show. I think there's plenty of brilliant ones, and I didn't want mine to be the same. And then So we carried it up, and we got until the end of last year, into 2014, up to episode 100.
Wow.
Which was pretty good going. Yeah, I didn't know whether I was going to carry it on after that.
And so now it's fortnightly.
Now it's fortnightly, and what we've decided to do, I asked a few people, because, I might moan about user experience people, but, I do a bit of research. And I did ask listeners about which episodes they preferred, and a few people mentioned some of the doubles, where we had actually had me and two guests, particularly some of the film reviews or the film specials that we do. Because it's not just about business now. The unfinished business tag is really about still having things left to talk about. And it's less and less and less about business now. We haven't mentioned a contract or bank accounts or anything in months. But we do talk about Doctor Who quite a lot on Planet of the Apes. And people said, I really like that episode that you did with, Brendan and Jeremy Keith, for example, talking about Planet of the Apes. So I thought, well, why don't we just do that every week or every 2 weeks? So now I try to pair people up, and we have like a 3-way thing. And it's been brilliant. I've had some really good pairings over the last few weeks. I just put out one with Stephen Hay and Trent Walton, talking about designing in a browser and design workflow. I don't know when this is going to come out, but we're going to release one with Jeffrey Zeldman and Dan Maul talking about art direction and creativity in a couple of weeks. And these have been some really, really good shows. So it is kind of webby focused and creative focused, but along the way, we talk about all kinds of stuff.
So one of the things I did want to touch on is one of the things I learnt from reading your stuff early on in the days, and it's funny, I found myself at conferences talking to a whole bunch of web designers who are continually trying to shove round content from a client into a square hole that they'd designed in their theme. And I kept saying, why do you do that? Why don't you just get the content first and, design from the inside out, like Andy Clarke says to do? Because that was one of the first things I picked up on. And one of the overwhelming feedback I got was, well, hey, we can't get content from clients. What is your number one tip for getting content from clients before you start designing? I can see Sue laughing in the background.
Yeah. My number one tip for getting content from clients is write it your bloody self.
Yeah.
Because you cannot expect somebody that runs an engineering company or an accountancy firm or sells pension products or health and safety inspections to write good advertising copy for the web or anywhere else. Why would you expect that?
Yeah.
So this idea that we should just design beautiful containers and then expect somebody to produce the content to go in there is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Now, okay, that's for the kind of clients that I work with. I'm sure that if we're talking about a larger organisation, perhaps with a content team, then it's going to be a completely different matter. But a lot of the clients that we work with are not like that. They're busy running their businesses, and the website is something which they obviously want to succeed, but they're not sure how to make work for them. So we spend a huge amount of time now working on content for people. In fact, it's one of the directions that I want the business to go in, because my interest is much more in kind of advertising and what we're selling and the message and everything else. And that means often that, we need to write stuff. At least we need to edit them. So if you can't write it yourself because you don't know about health and safety inspections or pension planning, the best thing to do, I've found, is to spend a couple of hours actually interviewing the client.
Yeah.
Asking them some questions, with your sort of content strategy in mind. Ask them the questions, and they'll speak to you and describe things in a way which is much more sort of reader friendly than if you were to sit them down with a blank piece of paper and say, tell me about your pension product, because then they go into, our pension product is the best in the world, and it's you're not going to want to do it. So that actually works quite well for us.
Yeah. Excellent. That is great advice. Write it yourself. Do you have... So your podcast was sponsored at one point by Gather Content, right?
No.
It wasn't. Oh, but you mentioned Gather Content on the podcast at some point.
No.
Oh, I got that wrong.
Gather Content. Yeah, I'm thinking... Actually, we have to edit this bit out, because yes, they did sponsor that. Do that bit again, because I'm getting mixed up between Campaign Monitor and Gather Content. Yeah, it is. Right, yeah.
That's all right. We'll do it again and we'll just leave it in.
Don't do that. For the bit.
So at one point, Gather Content sponsored your podcast, right?
Yes.
So I've used Gather Content in the past. So the question was, do you have, and I suppose you have to say Gather Content now because they were sponsoring the podcast, but do you have a favourite tool for collecting content from clients?
No, not particularly. I mean, we'll use all manner of different things. I mean, we'll use that. We might use just Google Docs. What we tend to do is we tend to set up a shared Dropbox with clients as well. So we'll set up a project folder, and inside there will be a place where we put our stuff and a place where they'll put their stuff, and there'll be like a handover folder. So anything that goes into there is just for kind of conversation. And yeah, we just get clients to put a lot of stuff into Dropbox.
Excellent. Talk to me about Planet of the Apes.
I love Planet of the Apes. So I don't just love Planet of the Apes. I do actually love apes in general.
Right.
So I am a huge fan. If you can be a fan of gorillas, it's like liking gorillas on Facebook. How pathetic does that sound? But I do like gorillas a lot. We were just talking about this. We spent a day at Taronga Zoo in Sydney the other day, and we may actually go up to Melbourne Zoo.
Oh, cool.
One day this week, because they've got a little baby gorilla that's just been born, and these things are really special.
Yeah.
And we're not doing enough to protect those guys. And it was interesting. I haven't done it yet, but I'm actually going to write to Tim Cook, because I think he'd be interested in this. There's a particular mineral. I think they called it cobalt. I can't remember now. Something like that. Coltan. That was it. Coltan, which is this mineral, which is they add to mobile phones. It's probably one of the only uses, I think, for this particular mineral, and it's only found in Central Africa. So the only place where all of our phones get this mineral from is a very, very crucial part of Central Africa, in particular the Virunga National Park, which borders Rwanda and Uganda and Democratic Republic of Congo. And in fact, the Congolese government is talking about redrawing the boundaries of the national park to allow mineral rights and mining to happen inside the only place on the world where 800 mountain gorillas still live.
Wow.
I mean, how can that even be possible? I mean, surely there must be some way in which we can make mobile phones without this particular mineral. And I know that, they have these recycling programs at the zoo where they say, well, if you recycle your own phones, then we'll have less of a reliance on stuff they dig out of the ground. But we all know that shit's not going to work. We all know that mining companies are going to want to exploit whatever they can dig out of the ground. And it's very, very sad. And how people can actually even contemplate mining inside the only place in the world where these creatures exist is just beyond me.
Well, it's a matter close to our heart here in Australia, the Great Barrier Reef, which is one of the great wonders of the world. I'm not sure if it's one of the 7, but it is certainly one of the great wonders of the world. Is under threat because of coal seam gas mining and a whole bunch of mining activity going on the Queensland coast. So it's definitely a matter close to our heart here in Australia. One of the questions I've got for you is, you've brought so much of your passion for apes into your brand. It's so much of your personality into your brand. And I see that so rarely where, your brand is you. It is pretty much Andy Clarke that's built that brand, and so much of your personality is in it. Was there a time where you thought, I can even see a little ape hanging off your MacBook Power adapter over there. Was there a time where you thought, this is going to ostracise some potential clients?
Well, sometimes it acts as a filter. I mean, you look at the header on the current website, and I'll show you the new one. It's not for public release yet, but we actually do have a new header, which, if I can find the time to actually engineer it into the site, we'll get it out there. But yeah, sometimes those things act as a filter. And we say to clients, you weren't put off by the crazy apes that are on the site right now. And if they say, no, we thought it was fun, and that's exactly what we want them to do. And that the headers on the site we've done for a couple of years now, and they serve two purposes. They're supposed to be personality. We're selling to potential clients, but there's also a kind of a bit of a geek cred Easter egg type stuff. There's always a little bit responsive gag in there somewhere, which kind of adds a bit of fun. But I just think it's important to have personality. John Hegarty, who's one of the founders of BBH, Bartle Bogle Hegarty, the advertising agency, he said, your work's got to stand for something. It needs to have personality. And we don't really see that as much on the web. and I don't want to criticize other designers or other studios, but when you do look at a lot of portfolio sites, if I see another portfolio that features usually Apple equipment, where you're showing off a site on an iMac and a laptop and an iPad and a phone or whatever, I know that's a kind of a convention,
guilty,
or trope. So I just think it's important to have some personality, because the experience of working with somebody on a job is as important as the work that you get out the other end. In fact, if the experience isn't good, then you're not going to get good work. So I just think it's important to have that kind of personality. And I do worry sometimes that I don't want the brand to be just about me, because there are other people in the business. But it is what it is right now. I mean, I agonized about whether we would do Apes for the last header. And it's probably lasted a bit longer because we've been so busy. It's lasted a bit longer than I would normally have liked.
Excellent. Well, I'm a big fan. Final question I have to ask. Have you ever had Paul Weller around for tea?
No, and do you know what? I think he'd be a right grumpy bastard as well, to be honest. I've only ever seen Weller twice in concert. One was at the De Montfort Hall in Leicester in the UK in about 1979. I think it was on their last tour, and he stormed off at the end. He was playing with the Jam, and he stormed off like 2 songs before the end because something was up, and he wouldn't come on for an encore. And then my son and I, Alex, we saw him 2 or 3 years ago play in Manchester, and again he refused to come on for an encore, and he didn't speak to the audience between songs, and I just think he'd be a right moody git, to be honest. Brilliant musician, and I admire him immensely, but not one of those people that, when people say, who would you invite round for your perfect dinner party? Wouldn't include Weller.
Not Paul Weller.
No, wouldn't include Weller.
Andy Clarke, thank you very much for stopping in while you're here in Australia.
Pleasure, mate.
Sound rolling, camera rolling. That's my little.
That's your thing.
There you go. That's it.
Ready?
1, 2, 3.
See, people are going to think that it's some kind of medieval fire-slapping adventure.
That's totally going to be the pre-roll for this show. Me and Andy Clarke just whacking our thighs. Who would you invite around to your perfect dinner party?
See, this is in the outtake section.
Yeah, that's right.
There we go. Who would I invite round to my dinner party? I'm not really sure. What about John Lydon? Would be quite cool.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I reckon Morrissey could be a laugh. Actually, out of context. Yeah, I reckon Morrissey could be a laugh.
You better shake hands again because I might have talked over enough asking.
Okay,
well,
sure.
It's all part of the outtakes anyway.
Andy Clarke, thanks for popping in.
Well, how many times do you have to do this?
Thanks for popping in. Thanks for popping in.